There is a strange fear that lives quietly inside the human heart. It is not the fear of pain nor the fear of death. It is the fear of being forgotten, to live, to struggle, to love, and then to vanish not only from the earth, but from the memory of others. This thought unsettles us more than we dare admit. Yet there are moments when heaven speaks a stern warning. Tomorrow I will erase you from their memory. We tremble at such words. We imagine punishment. We imagine loss. But perhaps the warning is not merely about destruction. Perhaps it is about truth. We spend much of our lives performing before one another. We shape our words carefully. We polish our image. We measure our worth by applause, approval, and attention. We fear being misunderstood, excluded, or ignored. And so we build our identity upon fragile foundations, the thoughts and memories of other people. But what if all of that were taken away? What if tomorrow no one remembered your achievements? No one recalled your mistakes? No one repeated your name in conversation? No one held your past against you? No one praised you for your victories? Who would you be then? There is a mercy hidden inside this warning. For when human memory defines us, we become prisoners of it. We are chained to yesterday's failures and enslaved to yesterday's praise. We live as actors on a stage that never closes. To be erased from their memory may feel like judgment, but it may also be freedom. The world remembers selectively. It forgets sacrifices and highlights scandals. It ignores quiet obedience and celebrates loud rebellion. If your worth depends upon human remembrance, then your worth is built upon sand. But there is another memory, one that does not fade, distort, or decay. The Eternal does not remember as humans remember. He sees not merely actions, but intentions, not merely performance, but posture of the heart. If tomorrow you vanished from the minds of men, you would not vanish from the sight of heaven. And perhaps that is the lesson. We are warned because we cling too tightly to earthly remembrance. We tremble at being forgotten by those who themselves are temporary. Yet we neglect the gaze of the one who is everlasting. Consider this carefully. If being erased from human memory frightens you more than being distant from God, then your priorities have quietly shifted. To be forgotten by people is a small thing. To be unknown by God is everything. The warning, then, is not cruelty. It is invitation. It asks, are you living for applause or for eternity? Are you shaping your life for headlines or for holiness? Are you chasing visibility or are you seeking truth? When the noise fades and the crowd disperses, what remains? Only what was built upon the eternal. If tomorrow the world forgets you and heaven still knows your name, you have lost nothing of value. But if tomorrow the world remembers you and heaven does not recognize your heart, then you have gained nothing at all. So examine yourself, not in fear, but in honesty. For the greatest tragedy is not being erased from memory. The greatest tragedy is living a life that was never rooted in what lasts. There is something deeply unsettling about the thought of being forgotten. It stirs a quiet panic in the soul as if existence itself depends upon remembrance. From childhood, we begin forming an identity shaped by recognition. A child smiles when praised, cries when ignored, and quickly learns that attention feels like proof of being real. As we grow older, the methods change, but the desire remains. We strive to be seen, to be acknowledged, to leave an impression that will outlive the fleeting moment. We pursue achievements, gather accomplishments, collect titles, and build reputations, all with a subtle hope that our names will echo in the minds of others long after we have left the room. Beneath ambition often lies not merely the desire to succeed, but the fear of disappearing without trace. We equate memory with meaning, as though to be remembered is to be justified. If someone recalls our kindness, we feel validated. If someone repeats our story, we feel established. If someone speaks our name with honor, we feel secure. But when we are ignored, overlooked, or forgotten, something inside us trembles as though our worth has been quietly erased. Yet this fear reveals a fragile foundation. Human memory is uncertain, selective, and painfully temporary. People forget details. They misremember motives. They reduce entire lives into brief summaries. A single mistake can overshadow years of faithfulness. A single success can inflate an otherwise ordinary life. Human remembrance is not a reliable judge of value. It is shaped by emotion, bias, and convenience. To build one's sense of significance upon such unstable ground is to construct a house upon shifting sand. The fear of being forgotten grows stronger in a world that measures visibility as virtue. Social platforms reward attention. Headlines celebrate notoriety. Even quiet acts of goodness are often performed with a hidden hope of acknowledgement. We begin to believe that if something is not noticed, it does not count. But this belief distorts truth. A seed planted in secret still grows. A prayer whispered in solitude still reaches heaven. A sacrifice unseen by the crowd is not unseen by the eternal. The anxiety of obscurity drives many to chase constant affirmation. Some speak louder than necessary. Some exaggerate achievements. Others carefully craft an image designed to secure remembrance. But this endless pursuit is exhausting. When identity depends on memory, peace becomes impossible. The memory fades. Generations pass. Names once celebrated become footnotes, and footnotes eventually disappear. Consider how quickly history forgets. Entire civilizations crumble into dust, their heroes reduced to fragments in books few people read. If entire empires can be swallowed by time, how much more fragile is personal fame? Yet we cling to it as though it were eternal. The fear of being forgotten is, at its core, a fear of insignificance. We worry that if no one remembers us, our lives will have meant nothing. But meaning is not determined by how many recall your name. Meaning is determined by truth, by faithfulness, by alignment with what is eternal. A life lived in quiet obedience may never trend or be applauded, yet it may shine brighter in the eternal realm than a life constantly praised by the world. To confront the fear of being forgotten is to confront a deeper question. For whom are we living? If we live primarily for human remembrance, then we have handed others the authority to define us. Their memory becomes our mirror. Their acknowledgement becomes our oxygen. But humans are inconsistent mirrors. They reflect distorted images, sometimes flattering, sometimes cruel, rarely complete. To depend upon them for validation is to remain perpetually unstable. There is a strange freedom in accepting that human memory is not the final measure of your existence. When you release the demand to be remembered, you are free to live sincerely rather than impressively. You begin to act from conviction rather than from performance. You serve without calculating recognition. You love without demanding applause. You forgive without ensuring your generosity will be recorded. In this freedom, identity shifts from external approval to internal alignment with truth. The fear of being forgotten loses its power when you understand that remembrance by the eternal carries infinitely more weight than remembrance by mortals. If the one who sees all knows your heart, your struggles, your silent victories, and your hidden tears, then you are not lost even if the world overlooks you. Human memory is brief, but divine knowledge is constant. Humans forget unintentionally. God does not forget what matters. When this truth settles into the soul, anxiety begins to loosen its grip. Being forgotten by people no longer feels like annihilation. It feels like release from a fragile standard. The question shifts from, will they remember me, to was I faithful? And faithfulness does not require an audience. It requires integrity. The fear of being forgotten is powerful, but it is not ultimate. It reveals how easily we attach our worth to unstable sources. Yet when we root our identity in something eternal rather than in passing recollections, we discover that obscurity cannot diminish us. Silence cannot erase us. Even if tomorrow no one speaks your name, your existence is not reduced. Your value does not evaporate with fading memory, for true significance is not granted by human recall. It is anchored in eternal truth. There is a subtle captivity that many willingly enter without noticing the chains forming around their souls. It begins with a simple desire to be liked, to be accepted, to be approved. At first, this desire seems harmless, even natural. We are social beings shaped for community, and there is nothing inherently wrong with wanting harmony, yet somewhere along the way, the healthy desire for connection can quietly transform into dependence. Approval becomes a necessity rather than a gift. Public opinion becomes a compass rather than a passing wind, and before long, a person may discover that their peace rises and falls not according to truth, but according to the shifting thoughts of others. Living for the approval of people is like standing before 1,000 judges who never deliver a final verdict. Their assessments change daily. What they celebrate today, they may criticize tomorrow. What they condemn in one season, they may applaud in another. Public opinion is not anchored in eternal principles. It is shaped by trends, emotions, and collective moods. To tether one's identity to such instability is to guarantee inner turbulence. When praise comes, there is a temporary elevation, a rush of satisfaction that feels almost like security. But it is fragile. It must be maintained. It must be protected. The moment criticism appears, the same heart that soared with affirmation now sinks under disapproval. In this way, a person becomes emotionally governed by the voices around them. Their joy is outsourced. Their confidence is rented. Their sense of self becomes negotiable. The prison of public opinion is particularly dangerous because it disguises itself as virtue. One may call it being considerate, being socially aware, being responsive to feedback. While humility and teachability are noble qualities, they are entirely different from surrendering one's identity to the crowd. True humility listens but does not collapse. It evaluates counsel without being consumed by it. It distinguishes between constructive correction and destructive judgment. The prisoner of public opinion, however, cannot make this distinction. Every comment feels like a verdict. Every whisper feels like a threat. Every raised eyebrow feels like rejection. This constant vigilance creates exhaustion. One begins to rehearse conversations in advance, anticipating reactions, editing authenticity, softening convictions, or amplifying them depending on the audience. Instead of speaking from inner clarity, one speaks from calculated strategy. Instead of acting from conviction, one acts from anticipated applause. Gradually, the self becomes fragmented. There is one version for this group, another version for that audience, and yet another for those whose influence feels particularly intimidating. The tragedy is not merely hypocrisy, it is loss of coherence. A divided identity cannot experience deep peace because it is always adjusting, always performing, always negotiating its own existence. Moreover, public opinion has a peculiar cruelty. It is quick to elevate and quicker to discard. Crowds are often drawn to spectacle rather than substance. They reward charisma more readily than character. A person who builds their worth upon such applause is building upon something that can evaporate without warning. The same voices that once praised may one day fall silent, and silence for the approval-dependent heart feels like annihilation. Yet the deeper danger is not in fluctuating praise, it is in misplaced authority. When human opinion becomes supreme, truth becomes secondary. One begins to ask not, is this right, but will this be accepted? Moral courage weakens. Convictions soften. The fear of rejection outweighs the pursuit of righteousness. History has shown that entire societies can drift into error because individuals feared standing alone. The prison of public opinion thrives on this fear. It whispers that isolation is unbearable, that disagreement equals disaster, that being misunderstood is intolerable. But these whispers exaggerate their power. Rejection is painful, but it is not fatal. Disapproval stings, but it does not define the soul unless invited to do so. Freedom begins when one recognizes that human judgment is limited in perspective and temporary in duration. People see fragments, not the full picture. They interpret actions without always understanding motives. They respond from their own wounds, biases, and expectations. To grant them absolute authority over your identity is to forget their limitations. This does not mean dismissing all feedback or retreating into stubborn independence. It means placing public opinion in its proper position, informative but not ultimate, influential but not sovereign. When identity is rooted in something deeper than applause, courage becomes possible. A person can stand alone when necessary. They can endure misunderstanding without disintegrating. They can accept criticism without internal collapse. This inner stability is not arrogance. It is alignment with truth that does not fluctuate with trends. The approval of others may be pleasant, but it is no longer essential for survival. In such freedom, authenticity flourishes. Words become sincere rather than strategic. Actions flow from conviction rather than calculation. There is rest in no longer rehearsing every impression. There is peace in knowing that while opinions will continue to shift like wind across water, the core of one's identity remains anchored. The prison doors of public opinion are not locked from the outside. They are often secured from within by fear. When fear loses its dominance, the door quietly opens, and the soul, long accustomed to confinement, discovers what it means to live unchained by the ever-changing judgments of the crowd. There is a thought that unsettles the heart at first hearing, that being erased from human memory might not be an act of cruelty, but an act of mercy. We instinctively resist the idea. To be forgotten feels like being dismissed, diminished, reduced to nothing. We imagine erasure as loss, as punishment, as a sentence pronounced against our significance. Yet what if the very thing we fear is the doorway to a deeper freedom? What if removal from the fragile record of human remembrance is not destruction, but deliverance? Human memory, after all, is not a gentle archive. It is often a courtroom. In it, our failures are replayed, our missteps rehearsed, our embarrassments preserved far longer than they deserve. Even when others forgive, they sometimes do not forget. Even when they forget details, they remember impressions. A single error can become the lens through which all other actions are interpreted. To live within the memories of others is to live within narratives we do not fully control. We may grow, repent, mature, and change, yet someone somewhere still holds an outdated version of us in their mind. They remember who we were, not who we are becoming. In this way, human remembrance can freeze a person in a former state, trapping them inside an image that no longer reflects reality. Is it not mercy, then, to be released from such confinement? Consider how much energy is spent managing reputation. We attempt to correct misunderstandings, defend intentions, clarify stories, and reshape perceptions. We long to be seen accurately, yet we rarely are. The effort to maintain an image can quietly consume the soul. It becomes less about living truthfully and more about controlling impressions. If suddenly that burden were lifted, if tomorrow no one carried your past version in their thoughts, would that truly be loss? Or would it feel strangely light? There is mercy in no longer being defined by old labels. There is mercy in the fading of past accusations. There is mercy in being allowed to stand before God without the echo of every human opinion ringing in your ears. Erasure, in this sense, strips away both condemnation and applause. For praise can imprison just as surely as criticism. When others remember us for our successes, we may feel pressure to continually perform at that level. The compliment becomes an expectation. The achievement becomes a standard we fear we cannot maintain. We begin to live not from joy, but from anxiety, striving to protect an image crafted by previous triumphs. To be forgotten by the crowd can free us from the tyranny of our own reputation. It allows us to return to sincerity. It invites us to act not for remembrance, but for righteousness. Furthermore, human memory is selective and often unjust. Quiet acts of faithfulness are rarely recorded. Private sacrifices go unnoticed. Long seasons of endurance are invisible to most observers. If our worth depended upon what others recall, much of what is noble would seem insignificant. Yet when the record of people fades, the record of heaven remains untouched. The mercy lies in this shift of focus. When human remembrance diminishes, divine awareness becomes clearer. One begins to care less about being known widely and more about being known deeply. The soul learns that visibility is not the same as value. A seed buried in soil is unseen, yet it is alive. In fact, much of its growth happens precisely because it is hidden. Perhaps erasure from public memory functions similarly. It conceals us from the noise so that inner transformation can occur without distraction. Obscurity can become a sanctuary rather than a sentence. It creates space for humility to flourish. Without constant recognition, pride finds less fuel. Without constant scrutiny, insecurity finds less provocation. The heart, no longer performing, begins to rest. This rest is not laziness. It is freedom from striving for applause. It is the quiet confidence that one's life is measured by a higher standard than popularity. There is also mercy in the fading of painful histories. Some have been wounded not only by events, but by how those events are remembered and retold. Stories get reshaped, motives misinterpreted, intentions questioned. To be erased from certain narratives may be a gift. It prevents the past from continually reopening wounds. It allows healing to occur without constant reminder. In this way, divine erasure can function like gentle rain washing chalk from a board, not to deny that lessons were learned, but to clear space for new writing. Of course, this perspective requires trust. It requires believing that significance does not depend on human recollection. It requires accepting that being unknown to many does not equate to being unloved by God. But once this trust takes root, fear begins to loosen. The thought of being forgotten no longer feels like annihilation. It feels like surrender of ego, surrender of image, surrender of the exhausting need to remain visible. And in that surrender, something surprising emerges, peace. The soul realizes that its existence was never sustained by applause. Its worth was never secured by remembrance. To be erased from human memory may seem like disappearance, yet in truth it may be refinement. It removes the excess, the noise, the distortions, leaving behind what is essential. And what is essential does not depend on being remembered by people. It depends on being held in the unwavering knowledge of the eternal. In that knowledge, nothing of true value is ever lost. Human memory is a fragile and flickering thing. It does not preserve reality in its pure form, but stores impressions shaped by emotion, preference, misunderstanding, and time. Two people can witness the same event and remember it differently. One recalls the tone, another the words. One remembers kindness, another offense. Memory is not a perfect archive. It is a living, shifting reconstruction. It fades at the edges. It rearranges details. It fills gaps with assumption. And yet we often allow this imperfect faculty both in ourselves and in others to determine worth, identity, and judgment. We tremble at what people might remember about us, forgetting that their recollection is partial at best. Human memory sees fragments, never the whole tapestry. It captures moments but rarely understands context. It records actions but not always the invisible battles behind them. A harsh word may be remembered, but the exhaustion that fueled it is forgotten. A failure may be preserved, but the long struggle preceding it remains unseen. In this way, human remembrance can become unintentionally unjust. It freezes individuals in isolated scenes rather than viewing their lives as unfolding journeys. By contrast, divine knowledge is not assembled from fragments. It is not dependent on perspective or mood. It does not grow dim with time or shift with emotion. It sees beginning and end simultaneously. Where humans infer motives, God perceives them directly. Where humans guess at intention, God knows the hidden currents of the heart. This distinction is not small. It changes everything. To be judged by human memory is to be evaluated by an incomplete record. To be known by God is to be understood in fullness. Humans often remember selectively according to personal impact. If your actions benefited them, memory may be kind. If your actions inconvenienced them, memory may be sharp. But divine knowledge is not self-centered. It does not measure worth by personal advantage. It measures truth by alignment with righteousness. This means that quiet obedience unseen by others is not lost. It also means that hidden motives masked by public virtue are not ignored. Human memory can be deceived by appearances. Divine knowledge penetrates beyond them. Consider how often people labor to shape how they are remembered. Reputations are curated, narratives are edited, mistakes are concealed or reframed. Much effort is spent controlling perception because perception often becomes reality in social spaces. But such control is limited. Even the most carefully constructed image cannot guarantee accurate remembrance. Eventually, stories drift beyond our influence. They are retold with additions or omissions. They are simplified into labels. In time, the complexity of a life may be reduced to a sentence. This reduction can feel unbearable because we know we are more than a summary. We are aware of the hidden tears, the silent prayers, the private struggles, the unseen sacrifices. Human memory cannot contain all of that. It was never designed to. Divine knowledge, however, requires no editing and suffers no distortion. It does not need reminders or revisions. It holds every detail in perfect clarity without confusion or decay. This constancy offers both comfort and caution. It comforts because nothing good is lost. Acts of faithfulness performed in obscurity are fully seen. Words spoken in sincerity are fully heard. Even when misunderstood by others, the heart's true posture remains visible before God. But it also cautions because pretense cannot survive under such light. One may deceive a crowd, but not the Creator. One may polish an image, but divine knowledge looks beyond polish to substance. Human memory fades with generations. Names once known become unfamiliar. Stories once frequently told become rarely mentioned. Cemeteries fill with individuals who were deeply loved in their time, yet scarcely remembered a century later. This is not cruelty. It is a limitation of mortality. Finite beings cannot carry infinite remembrance. Yet divine knowledge is not bound by generational turnover. It does not require cultural relevance to sustain awareness. It is not threatened by time's passage. The difference between being remembered by people and being known by God is the difference between a fading photograph and an eternal reality. One dims with years, the other remains vivid. When this distinction becomes clear, anxiety about reputation begins to soften. If human memory is incomplete and temporary, it cannot serve as the ultimate measure of identity. If divine knowledge is complete and eternal, then it alone holds final authority. This shifts the focus from managing impressions to cultivating integrity. Instead of asking how actions will be remembered, one begins to ask whether they are true. Instead of striving for a favorable narrative, one seeks alignment with righteousness. There is freedom in recognizing that misunderstandings do not erase truth. Being misremembered does not undo faithfulness. Silence from others does not imply invisibility before God. The heart can rest knowing that while human recollection may blur and bend, divine knowledge remains steady and exact. In the end, it is not the memory of people that determines eternal significance, but the unchanging awareness of the one who sees without distortion. And in that awareness, nothing of real value is ever misplaced, forgotten, or misunderstood. Identity is a delicate structure, and what it rests upon determines whether it will stand firm or collapse under pressure. When identity is built upon applause, it becomes dependent on repetition. Applause must be renewed, refreshed, and reaffirmed, or else confidence begins to wither. Praise feels powerful, but it is fleeting. It rises like a wave and falls just as quickly. If a person anchors their sense of worth in such waves, they will live in constant motion, lifted one moment and dropped the next. The heart that depends on recognition becomes hypersensitive to silence. When affirmation is present, it feels secure. When it is absent, insecurity creeps in. This instability reveals the weakness of foundations built upon human response. Applause is not evil, but it is insufficient. It was never meant to carry the weight of identity. It is a pleasant echo, not a cornerstone. When someone is celebrated for their talent, intelligence, generosity, or leadership, the celebration can subtly shift from encouragement to expectation. What began as appreciation becomes pressure. The individual may begin to fear losing the very admiration that once brought joy. Instead of acting freely, they act cautiously, guarding their image. Instead of growing naturally, they perform strategically. Over time, this performance creates distance between the true self and the presented self. The outer image thrives on approval. The inner soul quietly longs for rest. Identity rooted in applause is always negotiating its survival. It asks, what must I do to remain admired? What must I avoid to prevent criticism? In this way, the soul becomes a servant to perception. But identity rooted in God stands on different ground. It does not fluctuate with trends or opinions. It does not swell with praise or shrink with insult. When a person understands that their worth originates not from human admiration, but from divine intention, stability begins to form. They are valued not because of what they achieve, but because they are created, known, and loved by the Eternal. This kind of identity does not deny gifts or accomplishments. It simply refuses to treat them as the source of worth. Gifts become expressions of purpose rather than proofs of value. Success becomes opportunity rather than validation. Failure becomes lesson rather than condemnation. Rootedness in God produces a quiet confidence. It is not loud or boastful because it does not need to convince others of its legitimacy. It is secure in being seen fully, strengths and weaknesses alike, without rejection. When criticism comes, it may sting, but it does not shatter the core. When praise comes, it may encourage, but it does not inflate the ego beyond proportion. The soul remains balanced because its foundation lies deeper than public response. There is also resilience in this kind of identity. Applause fades, seasons change, roles shift, positions are lost, beauty ages, talents diminish. If identity depends on any of these, then time itself becomes a threat. But when identity is anchored in something eternal, time loses its power to erode significance. A person can walk through seasons of obscurity without despair because their value is not measured by visibility. They can endure misunderstanding without panic because their worth is not determined by perception. This does not mean they are indifferent to others, but it means they are not enslaved by them. Furthermore, identity rooted in God invites authenticity. Without the need to impress, one can be honest about weakness. Without the fear of losing status, one can admit mistakes. There is freedom to grow because growth no longer threatens worth. In fact, growth becomes a natural response to love rather than a desperate attempt to earn it. The applause-driven identity often resists vulnerability because vulnerability risks diminishing admiration. But the God-rooted identity embraces truth because it knows love is not conditional upon perfection. Silence, too, takes on new meaning. For the one dependent on applause, silence feels like rejection. For the one rooted in God, silence can become sacred. It is space to listen, to reflect, to deepen without distraction. The absence of noise does not equate to absence of value. The soul learns to rest in being rather than constantly striving to be seen. Ultimately, the question is not whether applause will come, but whether it will control. Applause is temporary, eternity is not. If identity is constructed on shifting sands, even small storms can cause collapse. But if it is anchored in the unchanging character of God, it stands firm despite weather. This firmness does not remove hardship, but it prevents disintegration. It allows a person to move through success without arrogance and through failure without despair. In a world obsessed with visibility, to root identity in the eternal is a radical act of trust. It declares that worth does not originate from the crowd, but from the Creator. And when that truth settles deeply into the heart, applause becomes what it was always meant to be, a passing sound, appreciated but not required, heard but not obeyed. The true measure of a life is rarely visible in the moments when the world is watching. It is not accurately calculated by the volume of applause, the size of a following, or the length of time a name circulates in conversation. Human systems tend to measure greatness by visibility and influence, by how widely a person is known and how long they remain remembered. Yet these measurements are deeply limited. They rely on memory that fades and standards that shift. What one generation celebrates, another may question. What one era considers success, another may call excess. If a life is evaluated solely by earthly remembrance, then its meaning becomes vulnerable to the erosion of time. But eternity does not measure as time measures. It does not weigh a life by popularity, but by alignment with truth. A person may live quietly, unknown to the majority, yet their life may carry immense eternal significance. Another may stand before crowds, widely admired, yet lack the substance that endures beyond the moment. The difference lies not in visibility, but in foundation. The real question is not how many will remember you, but what were you rooted in? A tree is known not merely by how tall it grows, but by the depth of its roots. Height can be impressive, but without depth it cannot withstand storms. In the same way, a life may appear successful by outward standards yet collapse under eternal evaluation if it was not grounded in righteousness. Alignment with eternal truth means living in harmony with what does not change. Trends change. Cultural values evolve. Public opinion shifts like wind across open land. But truth remains steady. To align a life with truth requires courage because it often demands faithfulness in obscurity. It may require choosing integrity over applause, humility over recognition, obedience over convenience. These choices rarely make headlines. They are made in private, in quiet decisions that shape character more than reputation. And yet, it is precisely these hidden decisions that form the substance of a life. The measure of a life is also found in love, genuine, sacrificial love that seeks the good of others without calculating return. Love expressed in small, consistent ways often goes unnoticed by the broader world. A patient parent, a faithful friend, a compassionate neighbor, these roles rarely receive public celebration, yet their impact may ripple far beyond what human memory records. Eternal measurement does not overlook such faithfulness. It sees intention as well as action. It values sincerity over spectacle. Moreover, the true measure of a life includes perseverance. Many begin with enthusiasm, but fewer endure with steadfastness. Endurance in righteousness when circumstances are difficult speaks more profoundly than dramatic beginnings. To remain faithful when misunderstood, to continue serving when unrecognized, to choose honesty when dishonesty would be easier. These are weights that eternity takes seriously. Human observers may not record these moments, but they are not lost. They are woven into the deeper narrative of a soul being shaped toward what lasts. There is also a sobering dimension to this measure. A life can be filled with activity yet lack alignment. One can achieve much and still drift from truth. Busyness is not the same as faithfulness. Influence is not the same as obedience. The world may applaud ambition, but eternity examines motive. Why was the work done? For whose glory? From what posture of heart? These questions penetrate beyond surface achievement. They reveal whether a life was constructed for self-exaltation or surrendered to something greater. When one understands that eternal alignment is the true measure, priorities begin to shift. Decisions are weighed differently. Temporary gain loses some of its allure. The fear of being forgotten loses its sharpness. If remembrance by people is not the ultimate goal, then obscurity is not the threat. What matters is not how long your name echoes in human conversation, but whether your life harmonized with eternal reality. At the end of all earthly memory, when names fade and monuments crumble, what remains is what was rooted in truth. Character remains. Love remains. Faithfulness remains. These are not erased by time because they were never dependent on time. They belong to a different order of existence. To live with this awareness is not to withdraw from the world, but to engage it with clearer vision. It is to pursue excellence without idolizing recognition. It is to contribute meaningfully without demanding remembrance. It is to understand that the deepest success may be invisible to many, yet fully known by God. In this light, the true measure of a life becomes beautifully simple and profoundly challenging. Not how brightly it shone before the crowd, but how steadily it reflected eternal truth. And so we arrive at the quiet and unavoidable question. If tomorrow your name were no longer spoken, if your image faded from their thoughts, if the world continued without recalling your story, what would remain? If all that survives is what was rooted in truth, then let truth be your foundation. If all that endures is what was aligned with eternity, then let eternity shape your choices today. Do not tremble at the thought of being forgotten by people who themselves are passing shadows. Tremble only at the thought of living disconnected from the one who does not fade. For memory on earth is like mist at sunrise, visible for a moment, then gone. But what is known by God is not mist. It is not fragile. It is not temporary. It is held in perfect clarity, untouched by time, undisturbed by opinion. If tomorrow he erases you from their memory, it will not mean you are erased from meaning. It will not mean you are erased from purpose. It will not mean you are erased from love. It may simply mean that he is teaching you where your true identity was meant to rest. So live in such a way that if the applause stops, your peace remains. Live in such a way that if your name is forgotten, your faithfulness is not. Live in such a way that when all earthly records fade, your life still stands firm in eternal life. For in the end, it is better to be unknown by the world and known by God than celebrated by the world and empty before him. And when that truth settles into your soul, you will no longer fear erasure, because you will know that what is written in eternity can never be wiped away.